Hello, this is an unofficial audio commentary for the film 10 Rillington Place, which came out in 1971, directed by Richard Fleischer, starring Richard Attenborough and John Hurt. My name is Antony Rotunno. I have no official connection to this case. If you want to follow it on the video, you should hear the air raid siren starting up there for the start of the film. Yeah, I used to live in the area and became interested in the case, and I've read a few books, but I have no unofficial connection. But gentleman I'm with does have a more official connection than I do. Jonathan, can you introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Jonathan Oates. I'm the author of John Christie of Rillington Place. It's a more realistic and well-researched account of Christie's life and crimes, and it was published last year.
Okay, so that is a biography of Christie rather than about the case 10 Rillington Place. There've obviously been lots of books about this, and I think when we get into maybe one of the longer scenes, we can talk about some of the books that have come out on the case. But basically what we have is a case that took place in West London in the 1940s and 50s. Whichever way you spin it, the main character in this, the main person, is John Reginald Halliday Christie. Could you give us an overview, if it's possible, of Christie?
Yeah. Christie was born on the 8th of April 1899 in Halifax. He was the sixth of 7 children born to Ernest John and Mary Hannah Christie. He went to school in Halifax. He seems to have had a very troubled youth, problems with his father, quite possibly, and also with taunting in his adolescence of his sexual prowess. But he was quite an intelligent lad. He was also in the Boy Scouts and sang in the church choir, quite a respectable figure in many ways. He was injured in the First World War and married a lady called Ethel Simpson in 1920 in Halifax, and he then had various offences for petty crimes, theft, assault, and so forth. But he and his wife reunited, and from 1937 lived at this address, 10 Rillington Place.
I was just watching here. This is Christie's second victim, Muriel Eady, as depicted in the film. No, we don't want to nitpick the film too much, but there are quite a lot of differences from the official story. So there's a couple in this scene, is that right? Christie wasn't actually in the police force, even though we can see him in his uniform.
Indeed, Christie had been in the War Reserve Constabulary from 1939 to December 1943. But this scene is actually taking place on Saturday the 7th of October, and at this time he's working for a radio factory in North Acton.
Which is where he met this lady here, isn't it?
Indeed. And he, as the film shows, he was inviting her back to his house, or rather 3 rooms in which he rented, in order to allegedly cure her health problems.
That's right, yeah. Quite an ingenious scheme, you have to say, even though it's pretty macabre. But I think the one thing you can see here from Rillington Place is that it was a slum area. Now everybody now, of course, with Notting Hill, thinks of it as very gentrified, but it was a real slum, wasn't it?
That's right.
This time.
Indeed. It's perhaps also worth pointing out that Muriel Eady was actually only aged 31 at the time of her death, and she's described as being a rather plump young woman, rather than a slender figure as depicted here.
Yeah. But do you think Christie's profile, is it quite a classic profile for a serial killer, would you say? Just the bare bones of...
Well, in some ways yes, but in other ways no. For example, he's not known to have indulged in petty crime or cruelty as a lad, whereas some do. He's not known to have suffered from any sexual abuse from family members or so forth. And he was, as I said, quite an intelligent man with an IQ of 128. So in some ways, no. But perhaps in some ways, yes, because he had a record of petty crime.
Early adult life.
That's right.
Yeah.
Just a bit dizzy.
Yeah. One thing is that, of course, he did go through the First World War.
That's the extract.
And it was exposed to mustard gas. Now, I think he made a lot of the effects of it. He said that he'd lost his voice for 3 years, was it? Or something like that. A little bit exaggerated.
He did exaggerate the effects, but there's no doubt he was injured by mustard gas in 1918 and was invalided out of active service in the armed forces.
No, I've done a bit of reading about the effects of war. I mean, probably most people can imagine the effects of war, but it's interesting that another person who was in the First World War and was exposed to mustard gas was Adolf Hitler. So I don't know. Who knows whether that may have had any effect on their brain. I mean, there have been studies to that effect, so that may be a factor that hasn't been taken into account.
Charles Lawton, the famous film star of 1920s and 30s, also was injured by mustard gas during the First World War in 1918, and ironically was also born in the same year as John Christie.
Oh, well, yeah. So this is extremely grisly. I think Richard Attenborough, we've seen an interview with him, haven't we? And not an easy part to play. And I think because they're actually filming it on the street, aren't they?
That's right.
About 3 doors down.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yes.
And as you can imagine, it's a pretty difficult part to play. And he said that he used to come home from filming just feeling sort of unclean, or So I think there's a definite effect to having this, because it's pretty grisly.
We're not actually shown in explicit detail what Christie did to his victims. Clearly he's going to strangle her, and it's usually assumed that he had sexual intercourse with his victims after death, but it seems more likely that he had sexual intercourse with them when they were unconscious, then strangled them and then buried them.
I mean, I suppose the theory from a lot of people is that if he's sexually inadequate, he needs either someone who's not going to question him, like a prostitute, for example.
Now this foot, sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's right.
This foot belongs to his first victim, by the name of Ruth Fürst, who was an Austrian refugee, Jewish, who's fleeing from Nazi persecution. Now it's unlikely that her completely undecomposed foot would still be there, because her murder took place 14 months prior to the murder that we're seeing now.
Right.
But clearly it's shown for allowing the viewer to know that Christie had killed people before Muriel.
And just a little note for people that aren't watching the video, we were just watching him dragging a corpse into his very small garden and burying it. And one of the things that always fascinates me about this case is that we're dealing in such a tiny house with presumably fairly paper-thin walls, and it's amazing that all these things were able to happen without anybody seeing them. And particularly, if you look at some photos, there's an overview. There are various houses that can see right into Christie's garden, so it's quite amazing that he got away with it. Anyway, here we are. Right, the caption said 1949, but again, it's slightly different, isn't it?
It was actually March 1948, which predates the birth of the baby Geraldine, who was actually born in October 1948. So when the Evanses arrived at the house, Mrs. Beryl Evans was pregnant.
So we're coming to the bit of the story. Basically, the story's jumped forward for 4 years, actually.
We just want to look it over, and see if it's suitable.
Yeah, basically, we know that John Christie killed before and after this period, which is 1948-49, and the couple there arriving, Tim and Beryl, and as we said, they didn't have the baby with them in reality, but in the film they've got the baby. So the central mystery, because as far as we're concerned, this is actually still an unsolved crime, although it's not officially an unsolved crime like Jack the Ripper, but we kind of think it is, because basically what happened was that the young man is just arriving here. We'll see later he's hanged for the murder of his wife and his daughter.
What's his name?
And then it turns out a few years later that Christie's crimes were all discovered. So it didn't happen straight away, but in the end he was pardoned. But one thing we should definitely clear up, everybody's now pretty much convinced that Evans was innocent. It was a miscarriage of justice. But when the report came out that actually gave him his pardon, it wasn't found that he was an innocent man, was it? Even officially.
That's correct. The official verdict in 1966 by Judge Justice Brabin concluded that Evans was probably guilty of the murder of his wife, but probably not guilty of the murder of his daughter. And of course, in 1950, he'd been tried for the murder of his daughter, not his wife, and therefore it was that verdict that he was being pardoned from, although that verdict has not been officially overturned, and officially Evans is still down on record as the murderer of his wife.
Yeah, it's quite interesting that a lot of people... we're on this forum, by the way. I'll just put a quick plug out for... There's a forum on the internet called the Christie case. If you put the Christie case forum into Google, you'll find it. And there's quite interesting debates about a few things. It tends to go around in circles because we have got to a point where there's probably not going to be too much more information that comes out about the case. And also there's a very good website, www.10, I think it's the number, 10, rillingtonplace.co.uk, which is very informative. Yes, now on the forum there are a lot of people who have taken the fact that he was officially pardoned and used that as a basis that he was officially innocent, which, as we're saying, in fact he wasn't. And do you think the reason that Brabin came to that might be that they were able to pardon him without saying that they'd hung an innocent man?
That's possible,
because it was a bit of a strange verdict, wasn't it?
Yeah.
No one. Well, actually, one other person did come to that conclusion, didn't they? But
that's all right.
Yeah. So what we're watching here is Christie supposedly taking an interest in Beryl Evans. Now, the actress Judy Geeson, I would say, in my opinion, is slightly more attractive than Beryl Evans possibly was. But a bit of artistic license, nothing wrong with that. But
Nice up here now.
So what's now the official version, which is basically what was in Ludovic Kennedy's book 10 Rillington Place, which this film is based on. It's not based on the official case per se, it's based on the book.
Medical stuff then. Consulting.
We've got Christie using his authority now.
For advice, Beryl.
We'll see that he has a lot of references to him being a doctor now. Do we know that he used to do that? Did he used to mention that?
Well, Christie liked to pretend he had medical experience and knowledge, although his medical knowledge and experience only extended to having 2 St John's ambulance certificates, and he was very keen on first aid, as was his father before him, and in his job in the British Road Services, 1950 to 52, he was the firm's first aid rep. He was very enthusiastic about carrying out first aid duties. He'd also often boast to women that his father had been a famous Edinburgh doctor, whereas he was a factory worker, and that he himself had skills and knowledge which, of course, were completely fraudulent.
Okay. And in the film, I mean, let's face it, with a film, I mean, you need fairly well-defined characters, because someone like Christie is pretty multifaceted. But they've taken him as a sort of an older man, trying to lord it over the couple a little bit, perhaps, showing them round the rooms as if he's a landlord, but of course he was only a tenant. And he'd actually lived in the top floor, hadn't he, before?
Indeed, that's right.
Graduated to the ground floor.
Interesting that the music that is now being played on the wireless is by Elgar.
So we've got a lot also in the film of Christie peeping around curtains. Now I think that does seem to be quite accurate. He used to have these lightweight plimsolls, and he used to sort of shuffle around the house quite silently. It was always like to know who was coming through the door, and I think he even made a spy hole, didn't he? Is that right? Is that accurate?
I believe it may be.
Yeah.
Now, it's perhaps worth mentioning that Timothy Evans, who we see here on the right, of course, had quite a limited education, and his reading and writing skills were not particularly high. And in the film here, we see, as in real life, that Evanses were in arrears to the landlord. The Evanses were actually often in debt with their hire purchase company for furniture, the landlord, and with various other bills as well. So this theme is quite accurate with Evanses talking about his debt and blaming his wife for the problems that they're in.
I want to train as a manager or as a managing director. Or something, you know.
Yes. Won't you have to learn to read?
John Hurt definitely gave a good performance. I don't think anyone would doubt that.
You have secretaries.
Was it with the National Archives? Quite a lot of documents got released in the 90s, and it was found that Evans,
Damn woman.
quite undisputably, wasn't exactly as he's portrayed here. I mean, maybe he was a bit...
In and out of here all.
What do we know? Was he more violent?
Oh, I'm sorry.
He's a fairly violent character.
It seems that he probably was. There's a reference to his wife having to defend herself with a bread knife and things like that. And there's references to neighbours.
What you been doing today then, eh?
Recalling him putting his hands around his wife's neck and things like that. So
She seems to have been pretty spirited, though, would you say?
oh yes, his wife was certainly not a doormat.
Yeah.
The young woman we've just seen in the film is called Alice, and she's an amalgamation of two people. One called Lucy Endicott, who's a friend of Beryl's from school, but later on had a couple of nights with Timothy Evans. And she's also a combination of Joan Vincent, who lived nearby, and her role we can talk a little bit about later.
Yeah.
Although in real life it was a little more ambiguous than it appears here.
And another one on the way.
Now it's quite important to note, I've seen here that Beryl Evans is pregnant with another child, which neither she nor her husband, despite his Catholic upbringing, are too happy about.
Unless I do something about it.
So this kind of thing isn't in dispute, isn't it? But in Ludovic Kennedy's book,
Do what?
he says that the girl called Lucy Endicott, who was staying with her, who, as you said, this character is sort of slightly based on.
Oh, no, you don't.
Beryl had told her that Christie was going to perform an abortion with her.
Anyway, I've
But
done
that's
it.
not necessarily true, is it? So,
Well, certainly
Even ask me.
Lucy Endicott denied that Beryl had told her
You
that.
bloody do. And does she know?
because I mean that really is
You
that's
know about
quite
this, didn't you?
conclusive if that was proved to be true,
Oh,
and it
no,
wasn't.
she's not. I know
Because
her.
basically the official version, which again, as we said, this is based on, comes from Ludovic Kennedy's book in 1961.
I wouldn't touch
The
her.
official version is that Christie was an abortionist, or certainly pretended to be an abortionist, and that you'll see in the film that he offers to abort this baby. Something which is pretty contentious, I would say.
I'm not the sort of man who can make do with just one woman.
This is Evans. I imagine we're in the KPH,
I mean, you take
either the KPH or the Elgin.
a year in alimony.
Kensington Park Hotel
Yeah.
is certainly the pub that Evans is known to
What do you think I've
frequent.
been waiting for me when
It's
I
still
get
in existence. It's on the corner of Ladbroke Grove,
That's right, Lancaster. Right?
Lancaster Road. The Elgin is slightly further down that road.
Tucked up nice and warm in
Yeah, because I actually used to live in this area, and I went into the KPH out of interest for a couple of times. It's incredible. It actually hardly moved on at all. It's been kept in a sort of very grungy condition. But the Elgin's a bit more gentrified. But from the outside, they look very similar.
3 in a bed, eh? How about that?
You can have my old woman if you like, that'll make up the set.
When you look at the map of this area, it's all very, very small contained area, isn't it?
That's right. Evans' family lived in St Mark's Road at number 11 at this period of time, which is only a few hundred yards away from Rillington Place. That's where his mother, his stepfather, his half-sister, his sister, and his stepfather's son were also residents.
Rich ladies. Are you not getting bored?
And from your book had a lot of addresses of the people that lived here. And Beryl Evans actually went to school at St Mark's Primary, right opposite, pretty much opposite, wasn't it, Rillington Place?
That's right.
And actually turned out that where Evans lived in the 30s, which about 10 years or more before this, he actually did live very near Christie, about one street away at one point. So it'd be fascinating to know if they ever ran into each other. I suppose we never know
She's
that.
tired.
I'm tired too. I'm tired of having you around, so come on, you bloody
So we've just seen Tim going off to the pub. Did like to have a few drinks.
Keep out of this. Just get
And obviously they're in a very cramped situation. It's pretty stressful for everybody. And I guess well, the money arrears didn't help, but did they seem to be a compatible couple? Like, if you take away all the external circumstances.
It's hard to say, really. The two are married after a relatively short courtship. Beryl seems to be reasonably well educated and intelligent, had a good job for a woman at that time.
Grosvenor Park, was it?
Indeed.
Grosvenor Park Hotel.
And later on, she works in a shop where she had been indulging in mild flirtation with a customer, and when Evans found out about this, he came round to the shop, made a scene, and his wife was dismissed from her employment, which is an indication, a little bit, of Evans's character, I think.
But then when she had the friend to stay, the friend ended up going away with Evans, as you said, for a couple of nights.
Indeed.
Which is a bit bizarre.
Which
because I'm not well.
does not happen here. And Evans later said when Lucy left him, he would run her over in his lorry. He's working as a lorry driver at this time.
Right. I'll go.
So we got Christie again, basically acting like the landlord.
Out you go.
I suppose he was, you might say he was a senior tenant, because the ground floor had a bit more space and he had exclusive use of the garden, which he probably made full advantage of.
I think Christie expected the Evanses to show respect to him as both an older man and a man of more intelligence and perhaps social class too. I think that seems likely.
He was more middle class, wasn't he? And this is a very working class area.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Although Christie himself, the job he was in wasn't earning that much more money.
No.
Although, of course, it was a white collar job, employed by the post office savings bank in Kew.
I mean, a ledger clerk is a fairly junior position, in fact.
It is indeed.
And he was a ledger clerk up to the age of 50. Just seeing him kind of talking to one of the neighbours and
Christie was held
his respectability.
Yes, yeah. Christie indeed was held in quite high respect, but by his neighbours. They didn't see him as a sinister figure at all. It's worth remembering that most houses in this country at this time had outdoor toilets and washrooms, sort of hangover from the Victorian terraces. This house being built in 1869.
Thank you, Mr. Christie.
And they used to have public baths, didn't they? People used to go to places to have baths. I wonder if that's why swimming pools are called public baths. Maybe that is.
Quite probably.
Well, I've
just put the kettle on.
So, I mean, it's pretty tough conditions they're living in, let's face it.
Now, this meeting between Christie and Christie and Beryl is not documented. It is an imaginary scene which may have happened, but it's quite crucial for the plot of the film because it introduces Christie to the knowledge that Beryl is pregnant, wishes to abort it, and that he is a man who can do so. Of course, he didn't have the knowledge to abort anyone, but of course the important thing is that he's able to convince people such as Beryl, who of course is far younger than he is, that he has that ability and he's happy to do so.
Great problems to you may seem simpler to an older head, you know.
I mean, the thing we should remember actually is that the official version, the Ludovic Kennedy version, is actually only based on one statement.
Yes, I see.
From Evans.
Tim.
That's right, isn't it? The second statement is pretty much the whole official version. Yeah, I mean, what's sort of mysterious about this case, and I guess makes it interesting, is that Evans and Christie were both pretty bizarre characters. They were both liars. They both made numerous confessions. They both confessed in different ways to have killed Beryl Evans. So it's pretty hard to really rely on anything they say. But
no, I understand that.
Wouldn't you agree?
Indeed.
Yeah.
I was just going to add to that. Beryl has said that her husband is earning £7 a week. Now that's with overtime as a driver. Now Christie was earning about £8 a week. So the actual differentiation in wage isn't very much.
Yeah.
It's just that Christie gives himself airs with his superior intelligence and perhaps education compared to his junior co-tenants.
It's quite a simple matter.
So while this is going on, let's just talk about some of the books on the case, shall we? So basically,
That's not a problem.
Christie was hanged in 1953, and then as soon as he was hanged, a lot of people started lobbying for the Evans case to be reopened. There was a 1-week investigation by Scott Henderson, which concluded that Evans was guilty. But a lot of people maybe wondered why, they'd only be given 7 days to work with him.
That's all right.
Christie wouldn't say anything before he was hanged. So the first book was Michael Eddowes, is that right?
Well, actually, the first book actually came out in the same year as Christie's execution. A book titled The Christie Case, very, very hard to get hold of.
You've got it here, yeah.
By Ronald Maxwell, who was a journalist, and he wrote the book before Christie was hanged. It's actually quite an interesting book, first hand by a journalist who was actually working on the case. And also in the same year, you have an interesting book, also very hard to get hold of and very expensive, by Dr. Francis Camps, who was the pathologist who investigated the bodies of Christie's victims and also performed an autopsy on Christie himself. And he wrote a book, medical and scientific investigation on the Christie case. Very technical, very medical, and goes into great detail of the bodies, but makes some very interesting observations as well, and includes some interesting pictures of the various corpses and skeletons found in the premises.
But the first one to revisit the Evans case was Michael Eddowes, isn't it?
And that was in 1955,
55, I think.
55, 2 years later.
Only 2 years, yeah. And I think that was a fairly short book. I think I hadn't read it myself, but it was a short book. And then Ludovic Kennedy wrote what most considered to be the definitive book, apart from yours, obviously. 1961, called 10 Rillington Place.
Then come on.
It's a bit hard to summarise. It's pretty long and detailed, but he came in with a thesis, didn't he? He didn't write the book as if he was going to investigate it and then come up with a conclusion. He basically had a conclusion already in place, which was that there'd been a miscarriage of justice. Have you got any comments about that book? It's hard to summarise the whole thing.
It's hard to summarise, but basically it's factually very slipshod, and it's clearly agenda-driven, which Kennedy admitted in the opening pages. He is aiming at a certain conclusion, and he tends to ignore facts which are contrary to that conclusion, and to emphasise the ones which tend to support his case. He uses lots of supposition, and occasionally puts words into the thoughts of both Christie and Evans, words, of course, which Kennedy never met either of them can possibly know.
I like Gregory Peck.
It's okay.
Just as a footnote, Gregory Peck, incidentally, who's mentioned here, a very well-known actor of this period, was also mentioned by Christie as being one of his 3 favourite film stars, along with Virginia Mayo, both of whom, incidentally, starred in the film Captain Horatio Hornblower, which came out in about 1950.
Okay. So, I mean, as I've said, Kennedy's book is basically based on one statement that Evans made. But then in the same year, two more books or one more?
Two more
books, yeah. Rupert Furneaux, The Two Stranglers of Rillington Place, which again went down the third route.
What do you think he can do?
That it was actually both of them involved. Now,
He's had experience.
in my opinion, it seems very hard that either of them could do something that the other wouldn't know about in that tiny house. I don't know what you think about that, but of all the mysteries, it seems to me that they would have both known at some point.
I think Furneaux is probably incorrect in his conclusion, although of course it's the one which Judge Brabin came out with a few years later, 1966, well, it seems unlikely, I have to say. The other book which came out in 1961 was by John N. Chance, The Crimes of Rillington Place, which is basically a novelisation, reasonably close to the facts, although with lots of invented dialogue, about the decline and fall of the marriage of the Evanses, resulting in his murdering her, and later the child on the same night.
Yeah, I suppose the weakness, obviously, as you said, there's lots of invented conversations, but it's quite interesting. There's lots of scenes of Christie sort of meditating. He describes it as meditating in the garden, because obviously he had two corpses in the garden at the time that this action was taking place. And yeah, it's sort of interesting, isn't it? But it's a novelist. It's actually called a novelist reconstruction, isn't it? So Rupert Furneaux came up with the conclusion that Evans had killed his wife and Christie had killed the baby. And I think if that was true, then it seems that
Will you tell Mr.
perhaps that they would have been in collusion to some extent, or they both would have known.
I don't like it very
I mean, do you think it's possible that the crimes could have gone on without both of them having some knowledge?
I think
possible?
both men were probably aware of what was happening. I think in so small a house it would be difficult not to, especially as Christie was off work for much of the period in question, and of course Evans was unemployed and living in the house for a few days after the crimes took place. It seems inconceivable that they did not have a knowledge of what was going on. But of course, their mouths were closed because of their possible and indeed actual involvement.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And obviously, everything Christie did was based on trying to conceal the two bodies he already had. I think it's fair to say that we know that Christie had a much higher IQ than Evans, which doesn't mean everything, because there's multiple intelligences. But I think it'd probably be fair to say that he probably could bamboozle him a little bit with words, or would have a verbal advantage over him. So it's not out of the question at all that a conversation like the one we're seeing or listening to here, which is basically Christie again trying to show off his knowledge and having quite a convincing air of authority over Evans.
It's worth noting the photograph of a policeman in uniform in the picture next to Christie. This, of course, is the police uniform which Christie obviously wore during World War II, and he was actually quite proud of his service in the police, and he won various commendations for his work there, and often mentioned it to people that he had seen war service as a policeman. The other item on the wall is certainly the St John's ambulance certificate, which for first aid, which Christie gained in the past, which he likes to display his knowledge and show off his own abilities.
Well, he was sort of officially disowned by his family, wasn't he? But he sent a picture to one of his sisters. He had a favourite sister, and he sent that policeman's picture. Actually, just looking at that actually looks like it's probably Richard Attenborough in that uniform.
So, mind you, they probably used to...
That actually looks slightly different to the real one.
Yes.
I don't know for sure.
Also, it's worth noting that the photograph, if you see the original in one of the many books and depicts, Christie is not wearing glasses. It seems that he didn't start wearing glasses until about 1948, when of course he'd been entitled to free spectacles on the NHS. It seems that his eyesight was reasonably good earlier in life.
I trust you.
But I think the round glasses almost fit the profile of him. It's just sort of rather sinister. It just seems to fit somehow. Yeah, he did look quite ordinary in one way, but he did have this rather remarkable domed head, with the domed head and the round glasses and the sort of sultry, whispery voice. Yeah,
we've never lost a father yet.
He sort of was ordinary and sinister at the same time, I think.
We do see the picture of his wife's mother, which was on display in the living room.
So as we're seeing here, Evans is going off to work. Christie's peering through the curtains again. And now he's going to carry out the alleged abortion of her baby, which will not turn out to be an abortion of the baby. But again, we don't know that this happened at all.
What we certainly do know is that Christie appears here that he is going to work, and then decides not to for reasons which shall become apparent. But in real life, Christie had actually been off work for several days already.
Tell him my back's been...
And we do know that he went to the doctor on this day, didn't he?
He did.
I think most people would agree that it's probably the day that,
I'll be all
that
right.
she was killed.
I'll phone from the corner.
No, you'd better go.
But,
They'll want these bills of lading and in.
Yeah, he was a frequent visitor to the doctor, so it's quite interesting that we still have the records of that, so we can monitor the movements to some extent.
Now, Mrs. Christie here is shown leaving the house with papers, so Christie can do what he's going to do. But as far as we know, I said Christie was at home ill on this day, as he had been for several days, and his wife was in the house all the time on this day, as far as we know.
I'm ready, Reg.
And we just saw Christie there looking in the mirror at himself. About the only sort of hint at self-analysis or any analysis that's in this film, really. He was never really officially analysed, was he? But
well, there were psychiatrists who spoke to him and interviewed him after he'd been arrested, and they made lengthy conclusions about his criminal personality. But I don't think introspection from his own point of view was very frequent. It's interesting to see the car and the truck on the road. Now, Rillington Place is a very small road, 10 houses on each side, and at this time none of the residents would have had cars, and it's probable that there were very few visits by people who had cars to this street. So it's rather interesting to see the car there. Perhaps it's in there for period detail.
yeah, just going back to the shot of Christie looking at himself, I suppose it does. I don't know. I suppose it gives the impression that has an uncontrollable impulse. And of course, your book, Jonathan, was trying to give the idea that evil men who commit evil acts are not just pure evil. That, character is a lot more complicated than that, a lot more complex. And he obviously did have an uncontrollable impulse, which is, you can take a person of a very similar upbringing. There are unfortunately quite a lot of children who have difficult childhoods, including some sort of abuse, and they don't end up doing what he did. So it's very difficult to analyse why exactly, isn't it?
Now, the doorbell, which is now ringing, is being rung by two workmen who have been sent by the council to do some work on the house and the outhouses in the garden. Now, this again is another change from reality, because in fact workmen had been employed in and outside the house for 9 days prior to this. The action here is taking place on the 8th of November 1949, but workmen had been at work here since the 31st of October, a fact that clearly the Christie would have been aware of.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's just for dramatic effect, isn't it? But yeah, it's interesting that there were workmen here around this time, and that's actually quite significant, as we'll see a bit later. There are bodies discovered in the wash house, and it seems fairly clear that the bodies couldn't have been in the wash house on the day that Evans said he put them there in one of his confessions. Yeah, I think it would be difficult to go through all the machinations of this case. There's so much detail and
Indeed.
things that we don't know. But,
Wash house, is it?
Just the outbuildings.
I thought you'd better come through.
It seems unlikely that if Christie was going to commit a double murder, he would do so at a time that there were workmen in the house and his wife in the house. Bear in mind, this, as I've said, it's a very small house. It would seem for an intelligent man to commit a double murder with lots of people in earshot would be unlikely, given the fact that on his previous murders he'd made certain his wife was away from home at the time, and
shouldn't take more than a couple of days.
clearly he had an instinct for self-preservation to make basic precautions.
Yeah.
Christie was a great tea drinker, incidentally. He rarely touched alcohol, but he insists on always giving his victims a cup of tea, or as he once wrote, a nice little cup of tea.
Yeah.
It's quite a strange, slightly genteel aspect, even old ladyish aspect of his character.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, a couple of people in a couple of books I've read have said he was a bit of an old woman, wasn't he? I think he's been described as a bit of an old woman, and it's
Yes.
yeah, there was a genteel aspect to it.
And of course, as we've said, he often visited the doctor on numerous occasions.
Yeah, phenomenally frequent in some years. Yeah. So what we're seeing here is this is number 7 Rillington Place. Is that the exterior and the interior? Is it the real house? Do we know?
Part of the film was shot in the studio at Shepperton, certainly.
Okay.
The inhabitants of number 10 understandably didn't want any filming taking place in their house. And in one earlier scene we see a nighttime scene in which the house is must be number 7. So number 10 is at the far end of the street, and the scene that we were shown earlier is clearly not number 10.
But the dimensions here are pretty accurate, would you say?
I think so.
Tiny,
yes.
isn't it?
Yeah.
Really?
Thank you.
Rupert Furner in his book refers to it as a doll's house, and I think that's a pretty good description.
Yeah, although I've noticed in Kennedy's book there are a couple of exaggerations. I mean, he claims that you could jump from the top window to the ground without sustaining any serious damage. I'm not sure if that's quite right, but I think the doll's house, as a sort of metaphor, is quite accurate.
Is it going to hurt?
Rupert Furner actually did visit the house, as of course it was still in existence in 1961 when his book was published.
Perhaps you better pull down the blind.
Yeah, just going back to all the books that have been published, maybe we should go a bit forward to the 1990s when John Eddowes brought out a book, Two Killers of Rillington Place. And what was really bizarre about that, not the first thing that's bizarre about this whole case, is that his interpretation was the total opposite of what his father had said in his original book, Michael Eddowes, The Man and Your Conscience. Now, John Eddowes had a pretty scathing about Kennedy, but in a way was written in the same way that Kennedy's was. And he had a pretty clear idea of what he thought, and then he just went through the evidence and fitted it to what he'd said.
Something we had to learn during the
It's
war.
worth noting that John Eddowes was the first writer to have access to the archives of the National Archives, and he did discover some new information. For example, he highlighted a builder's statement, a builder working on the house who recalled seeing Beryl Evans and Geraldine leaving the house on the morning of their murder. Indeed. Basically, the thesis of John Eddowes' book is that Timothy Evans was a drunken, psychopathic young man who killed his wife and daughter, and basically argued that Kennedy had got it all wrong.
Yeah, but then he had other theories about Evans putting the body of his daughter in a suitcase at Paddington and then planning to go off on his van and fly it off. Is it Brighton?
Could well have been
Fly it off
Brighton,
a bridge at Brighton, which again, I mean, there's no actual evidence of that. So I suppose if you take Kennedy's and Eddowes' books as two extremes, then the truth is somewhere in the middle. I don't know. This is a really heartbreaking scene.
Of course, it's worth pointing out that this scene may not have actually have happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I mean, it is referred to in a confession, in one of the many confession statements by both Christie and and implied by Evans, certainly. But we're not saying it did happen. If you believe it did happen, then you must believe that Christie, a reasonably intelligent man with a reasonable sense of self-preservation, would unlikely have killed someone when his wife and the builders were on the premises. In fact, John Eddowes argues that Beryl spent most of this day away from the house, which may have been the case. It's hard to know because no one seems at the time to investigate whether she was seen by anyone else on that day.
Yeah, and he's using the same contraption that he used with Muralidi, but I think we're pretty sure that she wasn't gassed. Is that right? Because her body was exhumed a few years later, 1953.
Indeed.
Yeah.
When the inquest was carried, the post-mortem examination was carried out on Beryl Evans' body, and there's no trace of any gas. So clearly, if Christie did kill her at this time, he certainly didn't do it in the way he's portrayed as doing here.
I mean, as I said earlier, I mean, we're not just trying to nitpick this film, because obviously it uses dramatic license, artistic license, and I mean, it is a very well-made film. I think really what we're trying to do is just point out that what's considered the official version is probably not totally accurate, and there's not really much to say about this. It's pretty grim.
It's worth noting that on Beryl's body there were blow marks to the face, which is clearly is what had just happened there.
But Christie, of course, well, we know that Evans had fought physically, I think, with his wife, but Christie also had a conviction for malicious wounding, didn't he? With a cricket bat.
Indeed, 20 years prior to this, he had assaulted the woman he was living with in Battersea. But how exactly physically powerful Christie was 20 years later is no question.
But what I'm saying is the fact that she had blows to the head doesn't really help us try and work out who killed her.
Hey, come on.
So here Alice is now Joan Vincent, isn't she?
Indeed.
Yeah.
Now Joan Vincent made several statements as to which day she visited number 10 Rillington Place. Here, of course, she's seen as visiting the house on the 8th of November, with results that we'll soon see. But on other statements, she was not certain on which day she attended the house.
Yeah.
And also, she did have problems with her memory, and had been to hospital about these. So we can't be certain that she actually arrived at Rillington Place on this day.
And in a rather bizarre twist, they actually gave Evans some stolen goods as well. Is
Indeed,
that right? Was it a suitcase?
Yes, Evans was given a suitcase, which had been, and a rug, I believe, which had been stolen from the house that the Vincents lived in.
I see. Right.
Evans did have a small record for theft. He'd stolen a car once and driven him out the owner's permission. Both Christie and fellow tenant Kitchener believed that Evans was a petty thief,
right,
as well.
Which, I mean, considering his financial situation and the area he lived in, I mean, it's not beyond the realms of possibility at all. Yeah, it's fascinating, though, the intertwining of Evans and Christie's lives.
Yeah.
They both knew the same people, they both sold their furniture to the same person, they went on trial in the same court, they were hung on the same scaffold. It's quite strange, and in a way I almost think, because I've got a psychology background, I almost think they're almost kindred spirits in a strange way, aren't they?
I think to an
so many
extent,
similarities.
yeah.
Just the strange. They had fairly similar natures in a lot of ways.
Now, of course, according to John Eddowes' book, Christie's were actually out at the time Evans returned from work.
Right.
Christie was at the doctor's, and his wife was at the library, which is wasn't too far away.
Yeah.
She's upstairs on.
And in Ludovic Kennedy's book, another slight factual error in his book is that he says that Christie could have got to the doctor's and back in 20 minutes or 25 minutes. And as I said, having lived there, I've been done that journey for other reasons, and slightly longer than that. But yeah, we know that Christie went to the doctor around 5 o'clock, was it, something like that?
More like 6.
More like
which
6,
is when
right.
the evening surgery opened.
Which is when Evans would have been returning from work, roughly, yeah.
We don't know exactly how long Christie would have spent at the doctor's, but certainly he would have probably have had to wait in a queue before being seen. Could have been some time.
I'm afraid she would struggle.
It also makes more sense if you believe Evans killed his wife, that he would have done so when no one else was around in the house when he'd come back from work, and the two of them had had an argument, with no one to hear her scream.
Yeah, of course. Here, when you saw Christie killing her, the screaming, if that was accurate, the volume of her screaming would surely have been heard by the builders. I mean, it really was a tiny house.
David, I told you that.
Now, the version that we're seeing here is one which is recounted by Evans in his second statement to the police at Merthyr Tydfil. He did give a variety of statements. This is one of 4.
She was only young.
And it's also interesting that while Evans has looked at his wife's face, he does not seem to have seen the strangulation marks around her neck, which were clearly were seen in the post-mortem, and she was strangled. It's curious that if indeed he was innocent, he did not notice these.
And of course Christie's giving him a story that she possibly would have died anyway.
What am I going to do?
She would have been ill anyway. So.
Come on.
Yeah, I mean, Evans and Christie both had this tendency to lie, as we said, in their statements and then change their statements. So.
Did you get the doctor?
Evans gave the first statement he gave in Wales was that he'd
Can't do much now.
someone had given him some pills. Someone in a transport cafe had randomly given him some pills for abortions, and that he'd put his wife down the drain outside Rillington Place. Now, the police went there. There was no body down there, and he wouldn't have been able to lift her body or open the drain cover anyway. So then Evans' second statement in Wales was completely different. He said, I only said that to protect a man called Christie. And the second statement he gave is basically what Kennedy's book and what this film is based on. So this conversation may have been happening, or it may not. We don't know.
With me, my lad. You knew about it. That's the point. You're an accessory before me.
When Evans went to trial, was there any animosity between Evans and Christie? We don't really know, do we? Because obviously Christie's there as a prosecution witness.
Well, all that we know that Evans said in prison was constantly to say that Christie done it. Allegedly, a fellow prisoner by the name of
I don't know nothing, you just keep climbing up.
Arnold Hume claimed that he suggested to Evans that he should put all the blame on Christie. Whether Hume actually did say this is of course unknown, and quite possibly not.
Because there's again, one of the things that the official version says is that there's too many coincidences for there to have been 2 killers in the same house. But I mean, one of them, for example, is Evans happened to
I could get you
Evans happened to name his neighbour as a man who was a murderer, and then it's found that he's a murderer later.
Just don't know what to
or something like he named the only man in that area who was also a killer or a strangler, but it did so happen that he was in the same house. He didn't just randomly pick Christie from all around London. So not sure if that coincidence is I mean, it is strange to think of 2 stranglers in the same house, but I don't know. I think there's lots of strange things have happened in history. I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility.
Strangulation, of course, at the time was actually a very common form of murder.
Right.
So it's worth noting. And it's also worth noting that several people who were involved in the case, such as Dr. Keith Simpson and Police Sergeant Trevelyan, both believe that that such a coincidence was entirely credible. And it's worth noting that although both of them were involved in the case, they weren't too involved that such comments could be argued were merely self-preservation and self-justification.
You better see to the baby's supper. She'll be crying for it in a minute.
Are there any other books that we need to mention?
You for manslaughter.
Well,
Your book.
apart from my book,
Apart from your book.
the other three probably worth a mention would be the books by in the Great British Trials series, which came out in 1957, which gives a complete transcript of the trials of both Evans and Christie. So word-for-word account of what happened. It's a difficult book to get hold of and expensive too, but certainly worth reading to have the exact statements of both characters. The other two books wholly about the Christie case are the fairly recent years. There's one by Mr. Marston, a crime novelist, in a series of National Archives books on famous criminals, which basically is a condensed version of the Ludwig Kennedy book, sometimes including the same phrases.
It's just storifying.
There is another one written more recently, A House to Remember, which is takes the opposite view, takes the view that Evans killed his wife and daughter. It's a very short book. It really has nothing new to say at all. Apart from it has a more sympathetic viewpoint, perhaps, to Beryl Evans. Because Beryl Evans often gets a very raw deal, both in life, and obviously she was murdered, but also by many of the authors on this topic tend to be very dismissive of her housekeeping skills, or her personality, etc. And House to Remember does at least call for a more sympathetic view towards her.
Off you go.
All right, I will too. Well, I'll have to believe the truth.
Well, go on then, if you're going.
It's a very long scene
now,
here.
can I? I've got the baby to feed.
It's a very important scene, of course. It's pivotal to the whole plot of the film. And it's worth also recalling that the reason for the film being made was that there was a private member's bill to reintroduce capital punishment at this time, following various murders, such as the Moors murderers, the murder of 3 policemen in West London, and so forth. And therefore, a number of people who were strongly opposed to capital punishment decided that this film could be a powerful tool in their campaign to stop such legislation from occurring.
And I mean, Richard Attenborough and John Hurt have both said quite openly that they haven't really ever discussed any research they did. They just seem to both believe that Evans was innocent.
I'll look after that.
And I mean, you as a researcher is a good person to talk about this, but I do a little bit of research, not professionally, but
I'll wait
just
till I get a chance.
on topics I'm interested in.
The big
And I mean, it is amazing how much the public at large, and even very esteemed figures, they just tend to believe what they hear, don't they?
Yes.
You know, I mean, it's not. I'm not saying that everybody has the time to always read lots of books about things that they hear, but I wonder whether Richard Attenborough and John Hurt had ever read anything else.
Then I could tell people.
Ludwig Kennedy's slightly different because he was writing a book, and I guess that he had a thesis that he wanted to write his book.
What about the baby?
Based on.
Geraldine.
Oh, she'll be all right. It's very lucky, as a matter of fact.
You wonder.
There's a young.
It seems like an official version, as we discussed earlier. The official version is that Evans was a murderer. In fact, he killed his wife, but he just wasn't guilty of the crime that he was tried for. And presumably, the reason he was tried for the murder of the baby is that there was no chance of a manslaughter conviction. There was no chance of claiming
be able to have a
mitigating circumstances, I suppose.
That's probably the case. It's worth mentioning that Ludwig Kennedy also he was quite angry at the time that John Eddowes' book came out in 1994, and in the Country Times newspaper, he took the publishers to court and won an apology and compensation. Although not, I understand, from the author himself, but certainly from the publishers, which is an interesting thing.
Yeah, I actually spoke to John Eddowes on the phone once, and he sounded pretty. I wouldn't say. I don't know if it sounded angry, but a bit very passionate when he was talking about it. He was firmly convinced that what he'd written was the truth.
Earlier in this scene, Evans claims he refers to a story that he propagated about his father being an Italian count. Now, this story is often repeated in various books on this topic, although I have never come across anything in all the evidence I've looked at which said that he did say that, although he was known to tell tall tales and often did tell untruths. That's fairly acknowledged by most people who knew him, friends, family, etc.
As I was saying earlier, I mean, Evans and Christie had a lot of similarities. I think sort of a certain inadequacy was true in both of them, so they both tended to tell stories that increased their standing.
Now, the rooms in which Beryl's corpse has been deposited are the rooms of a man called Charles Herbert Kitchener, a retired railwayman of the GWR who lived in the house since at least the 1920s. At this time he was in hospital, so obviously absent from his rooms.
Should be alright in there for tonight. Take this. Who's this? Wedding ring.
Ironically, although he's the oldest inhabitant of the house, he was born in 1887, he actually had the longest life, and after this he went to Worthing, I think, in which he died in 1964. So therefore outlived Christie by 11 years. East Acton is mentioned here. You should perhaps recall that Christie had worked with Muriel Eadie at the Ultra Radio Factory in Park Royal, which is also in Acton.
So you think that may be a clue that the story he told Evans that he was going to send the baby off to a couple in East Acton, so I guess that's a little clue that may not have been true. That he took a name of somewhere he worked. And of course, the number 7 bus, if anyone lives in that area, stops at East Acton, finishes at East Acton.
We see Evans leaving the house on the same day as a murder. He did actually leave the house 6 days later, on the 14th of November, after having lost his job and having sold all the furniture, which, of course, as it was on hire purchase, was not his to sell, to a certain man called Robert Hookaway, furniture dealer, who we'll come across later on.
Yeah, again, I guess for the dramatic license of the film, having him hanging around for another 6 days before he left would sort of slow the story up a little bit. So yeah, we see Evans is leaving for Wales on the midnight train from Paddington. I think this is the scene now we're going to see Christie. We don't see him strangle the baby, but it's implied that he strangled the baby. Again, very grisly. Not a nice story, really, is it?
Indeed not. Now, there is some debate as to the day in which Geraldine Evans was killed. In this instance, it's on the same day as her mother. But some, for example, in Evans' second statement, he claims that the baby was still alive for another 2 days. Now, this seems unlikely on the grounds that a baby without food will scream, and other people will be aware of its being alive. Since no one seems to have heard of the baby alive after the 8th of November, it's arguable that she was killed on that day.
Yeah, I mean, it seems incredible that baby could be left crying. I mean, some of the statements that she said that Christie went off to work and then fed her when he came back. But you can't leave a baby.
Now, this street is Mount Pleasant in Merthyr Vale, and Tim is about to meet his aunt and uncle, Cornelius and
What are you doing down here?
Vivian.
Come in.
Lynch. Yeah.
Indeed. And of course, Christie Evans rather grew up in Merthyr Vale. He was born there in 1924.
What are you doing in this neck of the woods?
Sit down, Tim. Take your coat off.
Well, me and the boss is touring round trying to find new branches. Only the car broke down in Cardiff.
There's tea, fresh
Lots of
fruit.
other little
You still
stories
like
he's
egg and
telling
fried
here.
bread?
Oh, smashing. It'll be a few days, the car. The big end's gone, they said.
You can see how smart Timothy Evans looks, and apparently in reality he was very cheerful during his stay in Wales.
Stay with Burial's farm.
That looks like a picture of John Hurt and Judy Geeson in the background, doesn't it?
It may well be, yes.
It is.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just been upstairs. He's gone.
Yeah, and another thing that we don't know in all of this is what Ethel Christie was aware of, do we? I mean, her statements tended to back up her husband, and it could be that they colluded, even if they were telling the truth, they may have colluded on a couple of things just to get their stories straight. But we don't know what she knew, do we?
Well, a few years ago, a number of letters from Ethel Christie to her sister in Sheffield were found in an attic in Sheffield. Unfortunately, these are not in the public domain. I have seen a small sample of them, which don't seem to give away anything of dramatic importance. But it certainly would be interesting to see the rest of them. Anyone who knows where they are, I would certainly be interested to see.
Contact us.
to see details of these letters.
Okay.
Ones I have seen indicate a very normal, boring life on the poverty line, basically. But I haven't seen 3 or 4 out of possibly 50 or 60 which were discovered.
I'm going to put links, by the way, on this video to the website and to the forum. So if anyone wants to give feedback, they can do that. Or any information that might be of interest, they can put it on the forum or on the video.
Now, the place in which Christie is putting the corpses is the wash house, which at this time the workmen were at work on. So it's inconceivable that they could have been working in such a small place, which they're stripped, and not see the corpses.
If you look at it there seems to be no way. I mean, okay, they're hidden it. He's hiding it there behind timber, but
Timber being left by the workmen, of course, but the workmen were still at work at this property for several days afterwards. And in real life, it's interesting to note that Evans asked when the workmen would be finished, and he indeed left the house on the 14th of November, which is the day after the workmen finished.
so it's possible he could have put the body in there on the day he left.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he actually looks a bit like Christie, doesn't he?
Hey,
The uncle there.
One of the spectacles, of course.
That was spectacled, yeah. But
the garage about the car?
yeah, I think if Evans was guilty, I think the idea that Christie wouldn't know is absolutely inconceivable to me.
Yeah.
I mean, as we've seen, which I think is fairly accurate, he's peering through the curtains. He has been said in a couple of books that he liked to always answer the door, or he liked to know who was at the door. So the idea of there being bodies there without him knowing,
He said he
to
hasn't
me,
seen
seems
better than the baby
inconceivable.
since the summer.
Now, the teddy bear here is mentioned in several accounts of the case, and it's shown as evidence that Evans thought his daughter was still alive. Now, there's actually no proof he ever bought a teddy bear at any time. The list of the items he had with him on arrest, or not on arrest, on being taken to the police, not include a teddy bear, and no contemporary refers to it.
Rich fellow, that's all there is about it.
Oh, Tim, where
Well,
are
never
you?
mind that.
She's not that sort of a girl, Tim.
Well, I'm going out. I'm bloody going out.
Evans is very angry here because his aunt and uncle have received a letter from his mother, which is strongly condemning her son for having left London and having sold the furniture, which was not his to sell, and landing her as the guarantor with a bill.
Yeah, she has a very strong word and says, "Oh, don't let him near me," or something like that. She almost disowns him, but it's possible that it might have been in the heat of the moment slightly.
Now, Evans is shown here in a tea shop. It's not known if he was in a tea shop prior to his visit to the police station. John Eddowes refers to him as probably being in a pub.
Yeah,
Which again is something that we can't verify.
Okay.
Yes, sir?
So from here we actually... This is more factual, isn't it?
It is indeed.
Because a lot of the stuff, the statements, we know Christie Evans came into this particular police station.
Chat with you alone, like.
The actor on the left is playing a character called D.C. Evans, and it was he who took Evans's first statement, which was portrayed here at Merthyr Tydfil police station.
I
No
won't give
relation.
myself up. I've
Obviously
disposed to my
Evans is
wife.
pretty
Now,
calm.
wait a minute. Do you realize what you're saying?
No, I know what I'm saying. I can't sleep through it. I want to get it off my chest.
So his first statement
She was
is...
expecting, see?
Well, some of it's
We have
fact,
one
isn't it? She was expecting a baby, but
Yeah.
then
Anyhow, I
talks
met this
about
fellow
getting
in
some
Ipswich.
pills from a
He just
random
come up to me
person
in
in
a
a transport
cab and give me
cafe.
this bottle of stuff. I told her
Yes,
not to
it's a
take it,
clear.
but she said she was going to
Most of
anyhow.
the story is clearly a fabrication.
So I come home from work and there she is dead. She had the empty bottle beside her. I didn't know what to do, so I didn't know what to do, so 2 in the morning I got her downstairs and I opened the drain outside the front door and I put her body...
And there's also lots of contention about some of the wording in Evans's statement as well. Some of it seems
And then I come down here.
too highbrow, or
Do you want to make a statement in writing?
some of the words he uses or turns of phrase.
Yes.
But-
I think that is the case. Clearly, this would have been. Clearly, his statements were taken down in writing by the policeman here. I think it's fair to say that when you are taking down someone else's speech or words, there is a tendency to use words that you would use rather than the actual words. In my experience of transcription.
Yeah, and I imagine sometimes with the police, if they're trying to pressure someone into confessing, they might say, "So, did this happen?" And then they say yes or no. You know, they would use some of their wording, and then the man who's confessing would say, "Yes, that's right." Or I would imagine they would suggest sentences.
Yeah.
I don't think that's particularly
Leading,
controversial
yeah.
to say that. Yeah.
Well, now, the drain where you said you put your wife's body, it's been examined.
Yeah, he told the story that he'd opened this drain, and the policeman says it took 3 policemen to open it.
I put it there.
You see?
So we know that Evans was quite simple and that he had but it's not
I expect so.
it's not been totally ascertained how mentally deficient he was. Would you say?
I think it's probably wrong to use the word mentally deficient.
3 men to lift it.
His education
I don't know
at school in Wales was certainly interrupted because of his various health
Your wife's
problems.
body was never down that drain.
So his reading and writing skills were not of a high order.
All right.
But on the other hand, he was a van driver for some time. He clearly had some
Spatial intelligence,
yes,
perhaps. Yeah.
yes,
True about the man in the car.
and was seen as being worldly wise by the police.
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying earlier, it's been proved that there's multiple intelligences. So,
Run up a lot of bad debts.
yeah, a lot of people don't have academic intelligence, could be quite worldly, almost as a compensation.
Now, the police inspector here is not named, but it's almost certainly Chief Inspector George Jennings, who had been involved in the investigation of the Hague murders early that year.
But there were actually some scenes filmed with a character called Inspector J, which was played by Bernard Lee.
Yeah.
They never, they wiped the scenes, they never actually put them in the film.
No, they just crept off.
And Christie, as we know, was a reserve policeman during the Second World War, so presumably he would have allied himself a little bit with the policeman. Yeah.
Yes.
It's not beyond the realms of possibility.
He would certainly have made his experience of police work known to them if they were unaware of it previously.
And now, here we have this remarkable situation where, of course, he's got 2 bodies already in the garden. The police are there, and
They're all about the torso murder.
is it verified that there was a thigh bone propping up the fence?
I believe it is.
That just to me,
incredible.
to me, the fact that he would leave that there is just absolutely remarkable. It's just one of those bizarre things that
I left the kettle on in the kitchen. I'll just...
seems to have been fairly well verified, but really strange.
Evidently nobody noticed.
Nobody noticed, yeah. Well, John Hurt, of course, did an official audio commentary of this film, which is on the DVD. And he does keep talking about the naivety of this period. And I suppose, as we've discussed before, I guess it's fair to say that people didn't quite analyse things the way they do now. We live in a culture where we seem to be always analysing everything we're doing or everything other people are doing. So I guess if you're not looking for it or you're not expecting it, maybe you wouldn't find it. But also around this time, the skull of Muriel Eady, which was a lady who he was killing in the first scene, was dug up by the dog, is that right?
That's correct.
Ended up in a bombed out house found by some children. And was that actually while this was happening, do we know, or was it just around
about this time?
Around this time,
Christie was quite vague in his statement, as he was vague in many statements.
It's a bundle of something. Do you know what's in it?
So here's the police finding the bodies in the wash house.
Something all wrapped up. Is that yours?
No, I don't think so.
Well, feel it. Feel it.
Now, of course, in this film we are shown that Ethel Christie is aware of both murders, and therefore certainly aware that what is in these bundles, yet keeps quiet, presumably for her husband's sake. Yet it seems at the time that she was genuinely surprised at what was in these bundles, and it seems unlikely she would have known before they were found what was in there.
I mean, actually, to be honest, the portrayal here by Pat Haywood doesn't quite follow Kennedy's portrayal of her, because he sees her as very meek and just someone who would do almost anything her husband says. But as we'll see later on, she remarks to her husband that she knows what he's been doing. So she doesn't seem too meek and submissive.
You're going to keep this up all the way to...
Not really. I mean,
in the scene here in the railway station, the police officers did indeed talk to Evans, mainly about football.
Right, yeah, he supports QPR.
Today I found the dead body of your wife, Beryl Evans, concealed in a wash house at 10 Rillington Place, Notting Hill.
These are the actual
Also,
words
the body
which
of your
were
baby
used.
Geraldine in the same outbuilding, and this clothing was found on them.
And as we see here, the Evans that's portrayed by John Hurt is very surprised that his daughter is also died.
In both cases, I have reason to believe
He's supposed to be with the family in East
for their
Acton.
deaths.
And this we know he said yes.
Yes.
So they say we have reason to believe that you're responsible for their deaths, and he just says yes. Now, Ludovic Kennedy's book, he has quite a long chapter all about Chinese brainwashing techniques, and the fact that admittance of yes is probably quite ambiguous.
And took her down to the flat below.
Again, this statement, which the policeman is reading out, it is Evans's first statement made at Notting Hill Police Station. He did go on to make a more lengthy statement, which is excluded from here. And he also spoke to at least 2 other policemen, admitting his guilt in both the cases of murder, which again are not shown here.
Strange that if they had the tie, I guess they couldn't find any fibres on the tie. I mean, surely if this happened now, I mean, there wouldn't be any doubt with the forensics they've got now. Because the tie apparently was left around the baby.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah, it still seems odd, doesn't it? I mean, they wouldn't have found something on the tie.
Mr. Christie,
I think one of the things is that maybe
I have got to
the
suggest
police
to you,
never really had any
and I
doubt.
do not want there to be
yeah.
any
You know, the police
misapprehensions about it,
want to solve
that
murders.
you are responsible.
You know, when a
for
murder
Mrs.
happens, the
Evans.
police want to solve it.
And
You know,
I'll
it's
here.
for various reasons.
Or if that is not so, that at least
Now, this
we
is
know very
day
much
2
more
of the
about
trial of
those
Timothy
deaths.
Evans. It took place in January 1950, and the barrister speaking is Malcolm Morris, obviously defending Timothy
Did you know
Evans.
that Mrs.
And
Evans was pregnant in November last year?
And the prosecution barrister had the interesting name of Christmas Humphreys.
Or Mr. Evans?
Christmas Humphreys'
And he was a
father.
Buddhist as well, wasn't he?
He was indeed, and he wrote an autobiography, which I'm reading at the moment,
Oh, right.
in which it's worth mentioning that that Mr. Humphreys' father was Travers Humphreys, who was a very famous barrister and judge at trial of such men as Bride in the Bath
If you or your
and
wife would come
later
to me
John
in
Hay.
the first place, I could have done it for you without any risk.
Robert Hardy, quite a famous actor.
Yes. Prior to his days
Do you
in
remember him
All
saying
Creatures
to you,
Great and
I
Small.
don't think you knew anything about medical stuff?
No, and that you said that you'd been training to be a doctor before the war.
It's interesting here that
Nonsense.
Evans is in this
You remember
situation. He's
showing Evans
not very
some
literate, not very
medical
well
books in your
educated.
flat. I've not got
And he's got these two barristers,
Except
these two
John's ambulance.
two barristers duking it out, prosecution and
this book to
defence. And someone once said of a lot of
I
murder
dare say it's
trials,
obsolete, but did you
the
show
actual
it, sir?
defendant is almost immaterial sometimes
Did you not
because
tell Evans
often
that
the
you had
law
been
is about the
doing
prosecution
training in
defence
medical
duking it
matters
out
before the war,
together.
and you stopped the training because of an accident.
Evans may well have not been aware of what a lot of this language means, you know.
You gave evidence
A lot of the more
yesterday
technical
during
language.
the night of Tuesday, the 8th of November.
Most of Morris's comments here are taken from the second statement made by Evans at Merthyr Tydfil.
Which is the one that implicates Christie, obviously. Yeah. So they decided to put everything on that. didn't
Yeah.
they? Yeah. Yeah.
Quite sure about that. Absolutely, sir.
Do you remember giving evidence at the Magistrates' Court at West London?
Yes.
You've never mentioned there this noise of something very heavy being moved.
And Evans' brother-in-law, because Basil Thorley, his wife's brother,
Well, perhaps it was
actually
not
expressed the thought that he thought Evans had done it, didn't he?
He was convinced of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Basically, because Evans said to him, "I'm sorry, Baz."
because of
Yeah.
Basil Thorley took this to mean that he was apologising to him for having killed his sister. And,
I'm still taking it as a matter of fact.
I mean, I think it's fair to say that Evans, even if he
you
didn't
still
kill them,
suffering
may have
from
felt
fibrosing
responsible. I mean, the way that it's portrayed here may not be exactly
I was in severe
accurate.
pain all night. I had to go to the doctor again last night.
So we know that Christie was actually ill at this time.
Gave me some pills to
Genuinely ill, I guess. Because he'd been going to the
awake
doctors.
for most of the night.
that was Dr. Matthew Oates at 30 Colville Square, Notting Hill.
Then you may.
The judge, incidentally, is Justice Lewis, who died a couple of months after this trial took place, not a few days after, as Elizabeth Kennedy states. And it's true that Christie was allowed by the judge to sit down.
And having read the transcript, it does seem that the judge was leading the jury a little bit, from what I've read.
In fact, you were a constable in the War Reserve.
But again, I think no one really had any doubt. So and there's no other plausible explanation, because what they know of Christie, why would he have done this? There's no. He was a petty criminal, as we know, but officially he hadn't committed any crimes for 20 years or so.
Now, it's worth noting here that Mr. Morris is casting doubt on the good character of Christie, which of course he has to do, because Christie is the lead prosecution witness in the case against his client, Evans. Now, Morris did indeed state that Christie had committed various crimes, as it says in Halifax and in Uxbridge. But he is incorrect to state that Christie had committed 2 crimes of violence prior to his time.
Right.
The reference to a crime of violence in Halifax in 1923 is often passed off as fact. For example, in Luther Kennedy's book, has actually no basis in fact.
Okay.
But it's true that he did assault the woman, Muriel Curls, who he lived with in Battersea in 1929. That is true.
But what is perhaps more important and relevant to this matter are there 2 other convictions recorded against you?
Yes.
The first of these being for violence at Halifax in 1923.
So he's leading him on here to
And the second when you were
talking about
sentenced
the
to
case
6
of
months
malicious wounding
for
in
malicious wounding
1929.
in 1929.
Yes.
It's very small, isn't it, the court?
Yes.
Very small.
I've actually never been inside, although I understand it is not as quite small as in the as the film portrays.
Because that's the set, presumably, is it? Yeah.
Not killed by abortion, of which there's no sign whatever, but by strangulation.
Yes.
Now, a word about your character. What were you doing in the First World War?
I was in the army in the First World War.
Fighting for your country.
Yes. I was gassed twice. I was blinded for 3
It's interesting to note that Christie actually signed up for the army several months before he would have been conscripted.
The last
in
time you were in trouble with the police for any offence was in 1933, was it?
Yeah, I mean, we do know that he was
17
he
years
did
ago.
like wearing uniform, didn't he?
In this
He
last
seems to
war,
fit into
in
groups
spite of your
at
disability,
school, but then he liked to wear
served in
uniforms.
the War
It's
Reserve Police
a bit paradoxical.
for many
Yeah.
years.
Well, I think if you saw a uniform as a policeman or a soldier, as someone in a position of authority.
Thank you, Mr. Christie.
But also part of a group, because he seems to be one of those people that did want to be part of a group, but then has a tendency to want to be away from it as well. So, yeah, bit of conflict there.
What are you doing?
So what's happening here?
I'm going to sleep in the front room.
She's going to sleep in another room, which suggests that she suspects her.
Front room?
Well, she knows what happened, obviously,
On the sofa
to
from
some
now on.
extent.
What's that in need of?
But clearly, we are meant to think that Ethel is aware that her husband is a double murderer, at least. We're not. It seems unlikely that this scene actually happened. There's no evidence it did.
No. It is you who voluntarily go to the police.
It's worth remembering. Shortly after
hearing about
this scene
the
takes
telegram
place,
which your
that
aunt had received
Ethel
from the
defended her husband against the charge of being a murderer when he was confronted with Evans's mother.
Yeah, outside the court.
Yeah.
It wasn't because of the lies. Then why did you suddenly go to the police?
So, I mean, here, this is a good example of what I was saying earlier about this very learned, very articulate
Seriously to the jury.
barrister questioning him,
You
putting
go to the
pressure on
police
him.
and confess to murder because you're worried about your daughter.
With great respect, there is no confession of murder. He said, I have disposed of my wife, I have put her down the drain.
It sounds very like murder.
And as we said, it's nonsensical to accuse Christie, isn't it? From what we know or don't know of Christie.
Might well be her body.
Andrea Morell here, who plays the judge, had played Dr. Watson in the
You made a statement to the
1959 Hammer film The Hound of the Baskervilles.
Exhibit 6, in which you talk of meeting a man in a cafe and of how your wife took these pills and died of them, and you found her dead.
And there haven't been any other films of this, have there,
You
or
remember
TV
that
programmes?
statement?
No,
Just documentaries.
I think there was a drama made in 1970
That is
called
untrue, yes.
Dreams of Timothy Evans,
Then made a statement
in which
set out in
it's
some detail.
about the scene where
How Mr. Christie
allegedly
gave your
Evans
wife
and Christie
something
met
which
each
caused
other
an abortion.
on the night of the
She died of
murder
that.
of Beryl
Right.
and have a discussion.
remember that
I
one?
think it's made by London Weekend TV. I've
Yes, I remember
never
that one too.
been able to have access to
Is
this,
that
but
one?
it'd be interesting. And that came out around the time of this film.
Quite surprised they haven't made one since,
Which you
actually.
confess to murdering your wife.
Well,
I suppose it's just that much further away, isn't it? I mean, the Moors murders seem to be fresher in people's minds.
Yes.
I was told of my daughter.
And also, I think there's a general feeling
True or
that
untrue?
that Ludovic Kennedy's book is correct. It's been reprinted several times, and I think that's, as John Eddowes has said, it seems the authorised version, and therefore there's no need to revisit it yet again. It's a great shame.
And that is the second statement you have made.
Of course, in one of the photos in Kennedy's book, he gets the names wrong. There's a picture of Evans's sister holding Geraldine, and then Beryl Evans next to him. And he gets the names wrong, but then when he reprinted it, it hasn't been changed, has it? So it does give the impression that Beryl was better looking or more prosperous than she seemed to have been.
We have shown your story about Mr. Christie giving your wife an abortion is nonsense. But you are the person who alleges Mr. Christie is the murderer in this case. Can you suggest why he should have strangled your wife?
So he says he strangled his wife because he was at home all day or something like that.
Yeah.
That was all he could come up with.
Home all day?
I think
there you go.
Timothy Evans here is being taken apart piece by piece by Christmas Humphreys in a what the law would perhaps describe as a very effective manner. I think Evans was the type of witness who shouldn't have been put in the witness box by the defence. It's not necessary for the accused to actually be in the witness box at all. And for example, in the cases of Neville Heath in 1946 and John Haig in 1949, the defence team decided not to put their client in the witness box.
I didn't even know the baby was dead till the police brought me into Notting Hill. Oh, Christie said she was in East Acton.
But do we know at what point he changed his mind and started accusing Christie? We don't really know, do we?
We do. He changed his mind on the 4th of December 1949 when his mother visited him in prison. We saw there his aunt visiting him in prison, which he never did.
His mother.
The court has found you guilty of willful murder.
There was nothing that prompted it, just
the sentence of the court
desperation, I suppose.
You'll be taken from this place to a lawful prison.
This is the third and final day of the trial.
And there you'll suffer death by hanging. And that your body be buried within the precincts of...
Interesting to note that not everyone who was found guilty of murder was actually executed at this time. Approximately 25% of those found guilty were actually executed. The majority 25%. Were not.
Let's just talk about this. This is verified fact, is it? As the sentence is passed, Christie starts sobbing.
He did indeed.
Do we know that? Yeah.
Yeah,
that's accurate.
That's fact. I suspect the reason for this is that as someone who has just been accused of a murder, double murder, he's sobbing in relief for his own sake.
Yeah.
But it could be, possibly, as someone who was against capital punishment, so he claimed.
Right.
It could be crime for his to sentence someone to death, effectively.
Is I'm in for something I haven't done, sir.
Very bizarre, though, isn't it?
Now, this scene is quite customary to happen for after a man has been found guilty of murder, he will be interviewed by a panel of doctors to ascertain his sanity. If he's found to be insane, he'll be sent to Broadmoor.
Christie's done it.
It's a very standard practice at this time.
And why were only a quarter of murderers hung? What happened to them?
Well, some were found to be insane, which is the result of this thing.
Right, I see.
Some were given a reprieve by the Home Secretary.
Right.
Some were sentenced to various terms of imprisonment.
Right.
To be out of the way, wasn't it?
It tends to be the more what are perceived as more heinous crimes, which tend to attract the death penalty rather than those perhaps where there's maybe room for doubt or so forth.
Christie done it. I say Christie done it. All right.
Now we're shown Evans being angry at this point. In prison, apparently, he's not known to have shown any particular anger of being just the
seems unusual,
sentence.
Yeah. Well, I think at this point, Evans is about to receive his punishment. Let's just conclude this part of the case, shall we? Because basically, the people that say that Christie was guilty and that Evans was innocent, essentially the main thing is that the coincidence of having two stranglers in the same house is too much. and we know what Christie did before and after this case. What would be the case the other way? If you could mention just 2 or 3 points.
I think the main case against Evans would be that it seems very unlikely that Christie would have committed a crime of murder in the middle of the daytime, in which many witnesses, including his wife and the builders, were in the premises, and Ethel may well have screamed. So it seems unlikely. Secondly, the second main point perhaps is that when Evans returns and sees his wife, if she was indeed dead and he was innocent, there would be strangulation marks around her neck, but he makes no reference to this. Yeah. So therefore, in my mind, it seems more likely than not Evans was responsible for the 2 murders.
Okay, but we're leaving it slightly open. We wanted to just present both sides, basically. Now, we just saw Evans being hung. He was hanged there by the actual man who hanged him, wasn't it, Albert Pierpoint?
Yeah.
And he remarked, I think it was about Christie, wasn't it? I hanged the monster of Rillington Place in the time it takes for a cigarette ash to burn down.
Indeed,
something like that. Yeah, and there's a very good film about Pierpoint. Did you like that film with Timothy Spall?
I have seen it, but it is inaccurate, in which case, because it has Timothy Evans stating Christie done it. Now, according to the memoirs of Pierpoint's companion, whose name I can't remember at the moment, Sidney Dearly, he says that Evans made no comment of that nature at all.
Right, but I mean, as a film though, I mean, it's quite effective, I think.
I'm going to bed now. I've taken a sleeping pill. I'm going to Sheffield in the morning.
Alright, so we're going, this is 3 years later, isn't it?
Yes, this
nearly 3 years.
December 1952.
What am I meant to do then?
There's quite a few problems with this scene. For example, the people that Ethel says that she's going to see are incorrectly named. The fact that there were lots of people in this house in 1952.
Yeah, that was a big part of it, wasn't it?
Yeah, lots of people. And also, Christie had indeed been in employment almost continuously from March 1950 to early December 1952.
Yeah, I mean, there was a boat called the Windrush which brought lots of West Indian immigrants to London at this time. So the house, it was precise opposite of what she just said, that there's nobody in it. It was very overcrowded, and we know that for sure, don't we?
Yeah, yeah.
And we also know that the tenant was, the landlord, Charles Brown, was a little bit manipulative and was of the Rackman type of landlord. I think that's what you put in your book.
Yeah, I think that's probably the case.
Yeah.
I mean, he's just certainly like to maximise the profit from his investment, shall we say.
By having single rooms, instead of apartments.
And several people in each room.
Yeah, exactly. And Mrs. Christie actually did take one of them to court, didn't she?
Yes. I haven't actually found the record of that. It's perhaps worth noting the minor point that when Ethel's body was examined some months later, there was no evidence of any barbiturates in her body.
Yes. Right. But he claimed that it was a mercy killing, didn't he? I mean, his statements as well, it's far too much to go into now.
Yeah.
They're very convoluted.
Now, Christie is about to bury his wife's body under the floorboards of the living room. About 10 years previously, he had temporarily buried the body of Ruth Fierce, his first victim, under the very same floorboards before he later put her into the garden.
And Ethel's brother actually slept in that room that night.
Indeed.
Is that right?
That's right.
It's another remarkable thing about this, that people didn't seem to notice things, but I don't know.
Yes, I mean, there are various witness statements by people who visited the house and didn't see or hear or smell anything untoward.
This is Christie walking down Portobello Market, very famous market, very near the house. Looking pretty down and out. Right, now this is a lady who's supposed to be Margaret Forrest. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Who was probably seen by Christie in a cafe, I imagine. There was a Panda Cafe, was very near that house.
Yeah.
Which is And she was supposed to go and see him twice, and she failed to make the appointment.
Terrible headaches.
Very fortuitously for
Oh,
her.
very unpleasant. Mind you, medical...
Christie actually had 3 more victims after he killed Ethel.
Yes.
Between January and March 19...
A real frenzy. Yeah.
But this scene, although he did meet one of his victims in a cafe,
How did you
he wasn't quite right there.
I should say I was.
Was?
He also met lots of other women in cafes who, fortunately for them, did not go back with him to his house at any time. However, 3 did.
Can I get you another cup of tea?
No, thanks.
Sure.
And their names are Kathleen Maloney, who's from from Southampton, convicted for prostitution. Rita Elizabeth Nelson from Ireland, who again had convictions for prostitution and theft. And finally, Hectorina McLennan, who is not known to have had any convictions for anything, and it's routinely stated he was a prostitute, but without any evidence for this.
Yes.
Unfortunately, all 3 of them were gassed, raped and strangled by Christie, and as we see here, they were all hidden in an alcove in the kitchen, and we see here he's wallpapering over the alcove.
So an alcove used for storing coal. Yeah, so he's papering over it, and as we'll see a bit later. This is Mr. Hookway, isn't it?
This is Robert Hookway, who bought the furniture of both Christie and earlier Evans.
Yes.
Now, in this scene, he is shown to have a rather contemptuous attitude towards the unfortunate Christie. But his statements, in reality, were that he was actually, he actually quite looked up to Christie. He thought he was a very intelligent, pleasant sort of man to chat with.
I was wounded in the war. It's tough luck, squad.
Yeah, he gives a good portrayal of a sort of London dealer here, doesn't he?
Yeah.
No messing around.
I'll have the van round us up and 1, 2.
Sorry, go on.
You can also see that Christie is obviously very hard up on his luck financially. He was unemployed at this time, wasn't receiving very much money, and was trying to sell everything he could lay his hands on, including to illegally sublet the rooms he had to an Irish couple,
For
Mr.
3
and
months.
Mrs. Riley.
For 3 months.
Yeah.
So he's leaving, this is March, isn't it? March 1953. So as you said, he had by now 3 victims buried in a small alcove.
Plus his wife under the floorboards.
Yes.
And the 2 skeletons in the back garden.
So at least, 6 corpses. Yeah, so it seems that he just spent a few months
Through my papers.
between killing his wife and when he left.
I was in all the papers.
Yeah, he seemed to meet a lot of people, and as you said, was trying to survive financially.
Now, he's here at a down and out hostel called Rowton House, which is near King's Cross Station. In the depiction here, he is treated with contempt by a resident of the hostel. But in reality, the only statement we have from a fellow resident was that, again, Christie was seen as a very pleasant, intelligent sort of man to have a chat with.
Yeah, he played snooker or was it table tennis or one of those. Yeah. And he did book in under his own name, didn't he?
Yes, and his own address for a week, quite openly.
Very strange.
But he left as soon as news that murders had been discovered in the newspapers.
Definitely something very peculiar about him, even outside of his crimes. I mean, very strange. Sort of mixture of arrogance and inadequacy.
Now these 2 men here shown moving in actually lived in the property at the time, in the floors above. Their names are Beresford Brown, and
who finds the bodies.
Who indeed. And his companion is a man called Ivan Williams. He's looking for somewhere to install a wireless.
That's
so he sees a wall in the kitchen which he thinks will be suitable.
Yeah.
But finds...
So Beresford Brown would have known Christie, would he, or
yes,
in passing?
Yes, Beresford Brown had been living in this house since at least about 1951.
Yeah.
In one of the rooms upstairs.
So the body that he's going to see now, using the torch, is Hectorina McLennan.
That's right. the other two victims of Christie's, you can see have been put in blankets. Christie didn't put Hectorina's in a blanket because he was concerned her boyfriend might return immediately and discover what was happening. So he put her in less ceremony.
Yeah, because they actually stayed at the house for about 3 nights, didn't they?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and Christie, with his classic Puritanism, wouldn't let them sleep together.
No, indeed. It's interesting that neither of them seems to have smelled anything untoward, despite sleeping in a room with 2 bodies. But perhaps it was winter time.
Yeah, well, both the Evans murders and these all happened in the dead of winter. So we finally find ourselves at the very last scene.
And this is near Putney Bridge, South London. The policeman approaching Christie is P.C. Ledger, an unusually tall constable.
I think that Star and Garter pub's actually still there. It was a few years ago, I think.
You can also see this scene in the beginning of a second Sweeney film, this location, certainly.
Oh, right. So yeah, he's been sleeping rough for more than a week.
What are you doing?
I think the PC Ledger said when he took off his hat, it was full of twigs, so he knew he'd been sleeping rough.
Yes.
Now, quite bizarrely, Christie actually had on him a cutting of the Evans trial.
Have you got anything?
He did, yes.
Yeah, rather strange.
No, nothing at all.
I think it says something about his need to feel self-important.
Yeah, because he was part of it, wasn't he?
He was a star witness for the prosecution.
Yeah. Could have been feeling guilty about Evans, who knows?
Possibly, yeah.
So this is the end of the film. He's caught. This is March the 31st.
John Reginald Christie.
And he was hung on July the 15th, so about 3.5 months later.
Come along.
In that time he was asked a lot about the Evans murders. He confessed twice to killing Beryl Evans, and there were different versions of the same story. But he never confessed to killing the baby, I don't think, did he?
He mentioned it in passing,
he hinted,
but later retracted.
Okay. Alright, this is it. We got to the end. So, if you find this on YouTube, leave a comment, and I'm going to leave links to the main Rillington Place website, which is very informative, and also to the forum, where you can read lots of discussion, which occasionally goes round in circles. But
that's right.
It is interesting because, as I said, Jonathan and I both would consider this an unsolved case, but really a case which is never going to be solved satisfactorily for everyone. We've got 2 books, Ludovic Kennedy, 10 Rillington Place, and John Eddowes, The Two Killers of Rillington Place, if you want to see 2 very opposite sides of the story. And then, of course, Jonathan's book, John Christie of Rillington Place, Portrait of a Serial Killer, which came out last year. All right,
thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you.